8-year-old Tommy sat in the back row of his third-grade classroom, nervously tapping his pencil against his desk. Today was career day at Riverside Elementary School, and every student had to stand up and tell the class what their parents did for work. He had been dreading this moment for weeks. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the classroom, casting long shadows across the colorful posters that decorated the walls. Mrs. Johnson, their teacher, stood at the front with a warm smile, holding a clipboard with all the students' names. She had been teaching for 15 years, and career day was always one of her favorite activities because it helped her understand her students better. One by one, Tommy watched his classmates walk to the front of the room with confidence. Lisa bounced up first, her pigtails swinging as she proudly announced that her mother was a doctor at the local hospital. She even brought her mom's stethoscope to show everyone. The class was impressed, and several kids raised their hands to ask questions about what it was like to help sick people get better. Next came David, whose father owned a popular bakery downtown. David had brought fresh cookies for everyone to try, and the sweet smell of chocolate chips filled the classroom. He talked about how his dad woke up at 4 a.m. every day to bake bread and pastries. The other kids listened with wide eyes, imagining themselves surrounded by cakes and cookies all day long. Then there was Katie, who spoke proudly about her mother being a firefighter. She showed the class a picture of her mom in full gear, standing next to a big red fire truck. Katie explained how brave firefighters had to be and how they saved people from dangerous situations. Several boys in the class immediately declared that they wanted to be firefighters when they grew up. As more students took their turns, Tommy felt his stomach getting tighter and tighter. There was Alex, whose parents were both teachers at the high school. There was Michelle, whose dad was a police officer who helped keep their neighborhood safe. And there was Ryan, whose mother was a nurse who took care of newborn babies at the hospital. Each story seemed more interesting than the last. The kids talked about visiting their parents at work, about family businesses, and about how proud they were of what their moms and dads did every day. Some brought pictures, others brought special items from their parents' jobs, and a few even had their parents visit the classroom to talk about their careers. Tommy looked down at his worn sneakers and fidgeted with the loose thread on his shirt sleeve. He lived with his grandmother in a small apartment across town, far from the nice houses where most of his classmates lived. His grandmother worked as a cleaning lady at the local hospital, doing the night shift, so she could take care of him during the day. She worked so hard, sometimes falling asleep in her chair after coming home in the early morning hours. But that wasn't the whole story. Tommy had never really known his father. All his life, whenever other kids asked about his dad, his grandmother would get a sad look in her eyes and simply say that his father was away serving his country. She never wanted to talk about it more than that, and Tommy had learned not to ask too many questions because it seemed to make her upset. Over the years, Tommy had created his own story about his father in his mind. He imagined a strong, brave man in a military uniform working somewhere important and doing something that mattered. When he was younger, he used to tell kids at school that his dad was a soldier. But as he got older, the story in his head became bigger and more detailed. Mrs. Johnson's voice broke through his thoughts. "Tommy, would you like to come up next?" The classroom suddenly felt very quiet. Tommy could feel 22 pairs of eyes looking at him as he slowly stood up from his desk. His legs felt shaky as he walked to the front of the room, his old backpack weighing heavy on his shoulders. Unlike his classmates, he hadn't brought anything to show or any pictures to share. He stood there for a moment, looking out at all the faces staring back at him. These were kids who had known each other since kindergarten, who lived in the same neighborhoods, whose parents knew each other from school events and community activities. Tommy had always felt a little different, a little apart from all of that. Mrs. Johnson gave him an encouraging nod. "Take your time, Tommy. We're all excited to hear about your family." Tommy took a deep breath and felt his heart beating fast in his chest. In that moment, standing there in front of everyone, the story he had been building in his mind for years suddenly felt very real to him. Maybe it was because he wanted so badly to fit in, or maybe it was because he truly believed it could be true, but the words came out before he could stop them. "My dad works at the Pentagon," he said quietly. his voice barely loud enough for everyone to hear. For a second, there was complete silence in the room. Then, slowly, a few kids started to giggle. The giggling grew louder and turned into full laughter. Tommy felt his face getting hot and red as he stood there, watching his classmates react to what he had just said. "Yeah, right," shouted Billy from the third row, slapping his desk with his hand. "And my mom is the President of the United States." The laughter got even louder. Kids were pointing at Tommy and whispering to each other. Some were holding their sides because they were laughing so hard. Even some of the usually quiet students were joining in, caught up in the moment. "Tommy, come on," called out Jessica, rolling her eyes. "Be serious. What does your dad really do?" But Tommy stood frozen at the front of the room. He had said it now, and there was no taking it back. Part of him wanted to admit that he had made it up, that he didn't really know where his father was, or what he did. But another part of him, the part that had been building this dream for years, couldn't let go of the story. "He really does," Tommy said, his voice getting smaller and smaller. "He works at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. This only made the laughter worse. Kids were now making jokes and calling out things like, "Does he know the president too?" And, "Can he get us a tour of the White House?" The classroom was getting louder and more chaotic by the minute. Mrs. Johnson tried to restore order by clapping her hands and calling for quiet, but the damage was already done. Tommy could see the looks on his classmates' faces. They didn't believe him. They thought he was making up stories to try to sound important. "All right, everyone, that's enough," Mrs. Johnson said firmly, finally getting the class to settle down. "Thank you for sharing, Tommy. You can take your seat now." Tommy walked back to his desk as quickly as he could, his face still burning with embarrassment. He could hear kids whispering behind him as he sat down, and he knew they were talking about what he had just said. He put his head down on his desk and tried to make himself as small as possible. The rest of career day continued, but Tommy didn't hear any of it. He was too busy thinking about what had just happened and wondering why he had said what he did. The story about his father working at the Pentagon had felt so real in his mind, so possible, that for a moment he had truly believed it himself. But now, sitting there listening to his classmates whisper and occasionally burst into quiet laughter, Tommy realized that no one was going to believe him, and the worst part was he wasn't even sure he believed himself anymore. As the school day went on, word about Tommy's claims spread beyond just his classroom. By lunchtime, kids from other grades had heard the story. They would point at him in the hallways and whisper to their friends. Some would walk by his table in the cafeteria and make comments about his Pentagon dad. Tommy spent lunch sitting alone at a corner table, picking at his peanut butter sandwich and trying to ignore the stares and whispers around him. He thought about his grandmother, probably at home right now, resting after her long night shift, at the hospital. She had packed his lunch with care just like she did every morning and had sent him off to school with a hug and a reminder to have a good day. He wondered what she would say if she knew what had happened. Would she be angry that he had made up such a big story? Would she be sad that he felt like he needed to lie about his father? Or would she understand that sometimes, when you're 8 years old and everyone else seems to have something you don't, you might say something you don't really mean? The afternoon classes seemed to drag on forever. Tommy could barely concentrate on math or reading because he kept thinking about what his classmates must be thinking about him now. He had always been a quiet kid, but now he felt like he wanted to disappear completely. When the final bell rang and it was time to go home, Tommy packed up his things slowly, hoping most of the other kids would leave before he had to walk through the hallways. But as he made his way toward the school exit, he could still hear whispers and see kids pointing in his direction. Walking home that day, Tommy made a decision. He would never talk about his father again at school. He would keep quiet during class discussions and avoid any conversations that might lead to questions about his family. It seemed like the safest way to avoid any more embarrassing situations. But what Tommy didn't know was that his simple statement, "My dad works at the Pentagon," was about to set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. Sometimes the truth has a way of finding us, even when we're not looking for it and even when we least expect it. The next morning, Tommy hoped that everyone would have forgotten about what happened during career day. Maybe they would be talking about something else, like the upcoming science fair or the school play tryouts. But as soon as he walked into the classroom, he knew his hope was misplaced. Billy was already at his desk, and when he saw Tommy come in, he nudged his friend Jake and whispered something that made them both start laughing. Other kids looked up from their morning work and started whispering too. Tommy felt his stomach drop as he realized that not only had they not forgotten, but the story seemed to have grown overnight. During morning announcements, while Mrs. Johnson was taking attendance, Tommy heard someone behind him make a fake walkie-talkie sound and whisper, "Calling the Pentagon, calling the Pentagon." More quiet laughter followed. Tommy pretended not to hear and kept his eyes focused on his desk. At recess, things got worse. Instead of the usual games of tag or kickball, a group of kids gathered around Tommy on the playground. But they weren't being friendly. Billy stepped forward with a big grin on his face. "Hey, Tommy," Billy said loudly enough for other kids to hear. "Did you ask your Pentagon dad to bring us some secret government stuff? Maybe some spy gadgets?" The other kids started laughing again. Someone else chimed in, "Yeah, or maybe he can get us a meeting with the army generals." Tommy felt his face getting hot. "I wasn't making it up," he said quietly, but his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. "Come on, Tommy," said Lisa, who was usually one of the nicer kids in class. "We all know you live with your grandma in those apartments by the highway. My mom says those are for people who don't have much money. People who work at the Pentagon live in big fancy houses." This comment stung more than the others because Tommy knew it was true. His grandmother's apartment was small, with thin walls and old carpeting. Sometimes the heat didn't work very well in winter, and the air conditioning barely worked in summer. It wasn't like the houses his classmates lived in, with big yards and multiple cars in the driveway. "My dad he just can't come home very often because his work is really important," Tommy said, the words sounding hollow even as he spoke them. Billy crossed his arms and smirked. "What's his name then? What's your Pentagon dad's name? We can look him up online." Tommy felt trapped. He had never thought about details like that. In his mind, his father was just this heroic figure, but he had never given him a real name or a specific job title. It's classified," he said weakly. "He works on secret stuff." The kids erupted in laughter again. "Everything is classified with you," Jake said, throwing his hands up in the air. "That's so convenient." From that day forward, the teasing became a daily part of Tommy's school life. Every time he tried to contribute to a class discussion, someone would make a joke about his Pentagon connections. When they were studying geography and the teacher asked about Washington, D.C., Billy raised his hand and said, "Tommy's dad works there. He can tell us all about it." The whole class would turn to look at Tommy, and he would sink lower in his seat, wishing he could disappear. Mrs. Johnson would try to redirect the conversation, but Tommy could see the doubt in her eyes too. She probably thought he was just a kid who made up stories for attention. Lunch became the worst part of the day. Tommy started eating by himself at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, trying to avoid the groups of kids who would walk by and make comments. Sometimes they would salute him mockingly as they passed. Other times they would ask him to send a message to the president, or wonder out loud if his dad knew any famous people. One particularly bad day, a group of fifth graders who had heard about Tommy's claim surrounded his table. They were bigger and older, and they seemed to think the whole thing was hilarious. "Hey, Pentagon boy," one of them said. "Does your dad fly around in helicopters? Does he have a gun? Does he know any spies?" Tommy kept his head down and didn't answer, hoping they would get bored and leave him alone. But they kept going, making up more and more ridiculous questions until other kids in the cafeteria were watching and laughing too. Finally, a teacher on lunch duty noticed what was happening and told the older kids to go back to their own table. But the damage was done. Tommy had become the school joke, and it seemed like everyone knew about his Pentagon dad story. At home, things weren't much better, though for different reasons. His grandmother would ask him about school each day when he got home, and Tommy would just say it was fine or okay. He didn't want to worry her or make her feel bad about their situation. She already worked so hard to take care of him, often, coming home exhausted from her night shifts at the hospital. But his grandmother wasn't stupid. She could see that something was bothering Tommy. He had always been a quiet child, but lately he seemed even more withdrawn. He would sit by the window for long periods, staring out at nothing in particular. He wasn't eating as much at dinner, and she had noticed that he seemed to be avoiding talking about his classmates or any activities at school. One evening, while they were eating dinner together at their small kitchen table, his grandmother decided to try to get him to open up. "Tommy," she said gently, "you seem sad lately. Is everything going well at school? Are the other kids being nice to you?" Tommy looked up from his mashed potatoes and considered telling her everything. He wanted to explain about career day and the joke he had become and how lonely he felt every day. But when he looked at his grandmother's tired face, he couldn't bring himself to add to her worries. "Everything's fine, Grandma," he said. "Just some hard tests coming up." She nodded, but he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. "You know, you can talk to me about anything, right? I may be old, but I remember what it was like to be your age." Tommy nodded and gave her a small smile. "I know, Grandma. Thanks." But later that night, lying in his bed in the small room they had set up for him, Tommy stared at the ceiling and thought about his father. He had always imagined him as this important, powerful man who was doing something meaningful with his life. In Tommy's mind, his father was someone who mattered, someone who made a difference in the world. The truth was, Tommy didn't know anything real about his father. His grandmother had a few old photographs tucked away in a box in her closet, but they were from when his father was very young, long before Tommy was born. In the pictures, he looked like a regular teenager, not like the military hero Tommy had created in his imagination. Sometimes, late at night, Tommy would wonder if his father even knew he existed. Maybe his grandmother had never told him about Tommy. Maybe he was out there somewhere living a completely different life with no idea that he had a son who was getting teased at school for making up stories about him. The weeks went by, and the teasing at school continued. It wasn't as intense as it had been right after career day, but it never completely stopped. Whenever there was a slow moment in class or during recess, someone would bring up Tommy's Pentagon dad. It had become like a running joke that everyone was in on except Tommy. Tommy started spending more and more time in the school library during recess and lunch. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a kind woman who never asked too many questions about why he was there, instead of playing with the other kids. She would just smile and help him find books to read. Interestingly, Tommy found himself drawn to books about the military and government. He checked out books about the Pentagon, about the different branches of the military, and about what people who worked in government actually did. Part of him was trying to make his story more believable, even if it was just in his own mind. But another part of him was genuinely curious about the world his imaginary father lived in. He learned that the Pentagon was a huge building with thousands of people working in it. He read about generals and analysts and all sorts of jobs that regular people had never heard of. The more he read, the more real his father became in his mind, even though he knew it was all just fantasy. One day, while he was reading a book about military families, Tommy came across a chapter about children whose parents were deployed overseas. The book talked about how hard it was for kids when their moms or dads had to be away for long periods of time, and how sometimes the parents couldn't even tell their families exactly where they were or what they were doing because of security reasons. This gave Tommy a new angle for his story. When kids at school would ask why his dad never came to school events or why they never saw him around town, Tommy would say that his father was on a classified deployment and couldn't come home for security reasons. Some kids seemed to buy this explanation, or at least they stopped asking direct questions about it. But Tommy could tell that most people still didn't believe him. The story had just become part of who he was at school. Tommy, the kid who made up stories about his dad working at the Pentagon. The hardest part wasn't even the teasing anymore. It was the way some of the adults looked at him. Tommy could see it in their eyes. Teachers, parents at school events, even the school principal. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and concern, like he was a troubled child who needed help telling the truth from fiction. Mrs. Johnson had even asked to speak with his grandmother one day after school. Tommy waited outside the classroom while they talked, his heart pounding because he was sure his teacher was telling his grandmother about the Pentagon story. But when his grandmother came out, she just took his hand and walked him home without saying anything about it. Later, Tommy would realize that this conversation between his teacher and his grandmother was more important than he had understood at the time. But for now, he was just relieved that he wasn't in trouble and that his grandmother didn't seem upset with him. As the school year continued, Tommy settled into his new reality. He was the kid with the fake Pentagon dad, and everyone knew it. He had learned to ignore most of the comments and jokes, though they still hurt. He spent more time alone, reading books and imagining what his real father might be like. What Tommy didn't know was that his simple claim on career day had set something in motion that would soon change his life forever. Sometimes the truth finds a way to surface even when we least expect it. 3 months had passed since career day, and life at Riverside Elementary had settled into a routine for Tommy. The jokes about his Pentagon dad still happened, but they had become background noise in his daily life. He had learned to keep his head down, focus on his schoolwork, and spend his free time in the library where it was quiet and safe. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, and Mrs. Johnson was in the middle of teaching a math lesson about fractions. Tommy was actually enjoying the lesson because math was one of the few subjects where his classmates couldn't make jokes about his family. Numbers were numbers, and there was no room for teasing when you were trying to figure out what 3/4 plus 1/2 equaled. The classroom was warm and comfortable, with the winter sun streaming through the windows and casting geometric patterns on the floor. Most of the kids were paying attention, though Billy was doodling in his notebook as usual, and Katie was staring out the window at the playground where snow had started to fall lightly. Mrs. Johnson was writing fractions on the whiteboard when there was a firm, deliberate knock on the classroom door. It wasn't the usual quick tap-tap that they heard when someone from the office needed to deliver a message or when a parent was dropping off a forgotten lunch. This knock had weight to it, like whoever was on the other side meant business. "Come in," Mrs. Johnson called out, not looking away from the board where she was drawing circles to represent pizza slices for the fraction lesson. The door opened, and Mrs. Rodriguez, the school secretary, stepped into the room, but there was something different about her usual cheerful demeanor. She looked nervous, almost formal, in a way that immediately caught everyone's attention. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter than usual, but somehow carried more importance. "Mrs. Johnson?" she said, glancing around the classroom full of curious 8-year-olds. "There's someone here to see Tommy Wilson." The whole class turned to look at Tommy, who was sitting in his usual spot in the 3rd row. His pencil stopped moving across his worksheet, and he felt that familiar sinking feeling in his stomach that he got whenever he was suddenly the center of attention. His first thought was that he was in trouble for something, though he couldn't think of what he might have done wrong. Mrs. Johnson set down her marker and walked toward the door. Tommy could see her having a quiet conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. The other kids in the class had stopped working on their math problems and were whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. Then Mrs. Rodriguez stepped aside, and Tommy saw him. Standing in the doorway was a man unlike anyone Tommy had ever seen in person. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with short dark hair and the kind of posture that made him look like he was standing at attention, even when he was just walking normally. But what really caught Tommy's attention was what the man was wearing. It was a military dress uniform, dark blue with gold buttons that caught the light from the classroom windows. Across the chest were rows of colorful ribbons and medals that Tommy had only seen in books and movies. On his shoulders were patches and insignia that looked official and important. Even to a group of 8-year-olds who didn't know much about the military, it was clear that this was someone who held a position of real authority. The man's eyes swept across the classroom, taking in the surprised faces of the children and the fraction problems still written on the whiteboard. When his gaze reached Tommy, it stopped. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, an expression that was hard to read but seemed to contain surprise, recognition, and something else that might have been sadness. The classroom had become completely silent. Even Billy had stopped doodling and was staring with his mouth slightly open. Katie had forgotten all about the snow outside and was focused entirely on the uniformed man standing in their doorway. 23 pairs of young eyes were fixed on this unexpected visitor who had just walked into their ordinary Tuesday morning. "Tommy, Wilson?" the man asked, his voice clear and strong but not unkind. It was the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and having them followed, but right now it sounded almost gentle. Tommy felt like his throat had closed up. He managed to nod, but no words came out. His heart was beating so fast that he was sure everyone in the classroom could hear it. This had to be some kind of mistake. Nobody ever came to school looking for him, especially not someone who looked this important. The man took a step into the classroom, and Tommy could see more. Details of his uniform. There were wings pinned above one of the pockets, suggesting he might be a pilot. The name tag on his chest read Wilson in clear, bold letters. Tommy's eyes widened as he read his own last name on this stranger's uniform. "I'm Colonel James Wilson," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet classroom. "I work at the Pentagon, and I believe you might be my son." If the classroom had been quiet before, now it was completely silent in a way that felt almost magical. Mrs. Johnson stood frozen by the whiteboard, her hand still holding the marker she had been using to draw fraction circles. Mrs. Rodriguez was still standing by the door, looking like she wasn't quite sure what she had walked into, and the students sat like statues, their math worksheets forgotten, trying to process what they had just heard. Tommy felt like the world had stopped spinning. The man had said he worked at the Pentagon. The Pentagon. The same Pentagon that Tommy had claimed his father worked at. The same Pentagon that had gotten him teased and laughed at for months. And now there was actually someone standing in his classroom wearing a military uniform, saying that he worked there. But more than that, this man had said he might be Tommy's father. His real father. The father that Tommy had never known. The father he had only imagined and dreamed about. The father he had built up in his mind as this heroic figure working in the most important building in America. Colonel Wilson moved closer to Tommy's desk, walking with the measured steps of someone who was used to formal situations. As he got closer, Tommy could see that they had the same dark eyes, the same shape to their face. It was like looking at an older version of himself, dressed up in the most impressive uniform Tommy had ever seen. "I know this is very surprising," Colonel Wilson said, crouching down so that he was at Tommy's eye level. His voice was softer now, more personal, like he was talking just to Tommy and not to the whole classroom. "I've been looking for you and your grandmother for a very long time." Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he still couldn't speak. Everything he had imagined about his father, all the stories he had created in his mind, all the dreams he had built up over the years, it was all suddenly becoming real in the most unexpected way possible. Behind him, Tommy could hear his classmates whispering in amazement. He caught fragments of their conversations. "Is that really his dad? He really does work at the Pentagon. Look at all those medals." Tommy was telling the truth the whole time. But Tommy barely heard them. He was focused entirely on the man kneeling in front of his desk, this stranger who claimed to be his father, and who had just walked into his life wearing the exact uniform that Tommy had pictured in his dreams. Colonel Wilson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he took out an official-looking identification card with his picture on it and the seal of the Department of Defense. "This is my Pentagon ID badge," he said, showing it to Tommy. "I work there as an intelligence analyst. I have for the past 8 years. Tommy looked at the ID card, then back at Colonel Wilson's face, then at the uniform with all its ribbons and medals. Everything looked real. Everything looked official. Everything looked exactly like what he had imagined when he had made his claim on career day all those months ago. Mrs. Johnson finally found her voice. "I'm sorry, but this is very unusual," she said, though her tone was respectful rather than suspicious. "We weren't expecting any visitors today, and Tommy lives with his grandmother. We've never had any contact from his father before." Colonel Wilson stood up and turned to face Mrs. Johnson. Even though she was the adult in charge of the classroom, there was something about his presence that commanded respect. "I understand your concern," he said. "I should have called ahead. But I was told that Tommy might be in school today and I couldn't wait any longer to see him. He paused and looked around the classroom at all the curious faces staring back at him. Tommy's grandmother contacted me through the Veterans Affairs office about 2 weeks ago. She told me about a little boy who had told his class that his father worked at the Pentagon. She thought it was time that Tommy and I met. The pieces were starting to come together, but Tommy was still having trouble believing that this was really happening. For months, he had been the kid who made up stories about his dad. He had been laughed at, teased, and treated like he was either lying or living in a fantasy world. And now, suddenly, his fantasy was walking into his classroom and introducing himself to his teacher. Billy, who had been the leader of most of the teasing about Tommy's Pentagon dad, slowly raised his hand. His voice was much quieter than usual when he spoke. "Sir, Colonel Wilson, Tommy really was telling the truth? His dad really does work at the Pentagon?" Colonel Wilson looked at Billy, then at the rest of the class, and then back at Tommy. There was pride in his eyes, but also something that might have been regret. Tommy was absolutely telling the truth, he said clearly, making sure everyone in the classroom could hear him. And from what I understand, some of you didn't believe him. The transformation in the classroom was immediate and dramatic. Kids who had spent months making jokes about Tommy's Pentagon dad were now staring at him with a mixture of awe and shame. The boy they had dismissed as a storyteller was suddenly the most interesting person in their class. And the father they had all assumed was made up was standing right there in front of them, looking every bit as impressive as Tommy had always claimed he would be. The silence in Mrs. Johnson's classroom stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Tommy sat at his desk, staring up at Colonel Wilson, still trying to process that this was actually happening. The man standing in front of him, wearing the impressive military uniform with all its medals and ribbons, was claiming to be his father. His real father. Mrs. Johnson was the first to break the silence. She cleared her throat softly and looked around at her students, who were all staring with wide eyes and open mouths. "Class," she said gently, "please continue working on your math problems quietly, while Colonel Wilson and Tommy have a chance to talk." But nobody moved to pick up their pencils. This was far too interesting and important to ignore in favor of fraction worksheets. Mrs. Johnson seemed to realize this and gave up on the idea of returning to normal classroom activities. Colonel Wilson looked around the room, taking in the faces of all the children who had been part of Tommy's life for the past several years. His expression was serious but kind, like someone who was used to dealing with important situations but wanted to make sure he handled this one with care. "Tommy," he said, turning his attention back to the boy who was still sitting frozen at his desk, "would it be all right if I sat down and talked with you for a few minutes?" Tommy nodded, still unable to find his voice. Colonel Wilson looked around the classroom and spotted an empty chair near the teacher's desk. He moved it over next to Tommy's desk and sat down, which helped reduce the intimidating effect of his tall, formal presence. Up close, Tommy could see even more details of the uniform. There were small pins and patches that he didn't recognize, but they all looked official and important. The name Wilson on the chest was embroidered in gold thread. The shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Everything about this man spoke of discipline, order, and authority. "I know this must be very confusing for you," Colonel Wilson said, his voice much gentler now that he was sitting down and speaking directly to Tommy. "I want you to know that I didn't even know you existed until 2 weeks ago." This statement caused a stir of whispers around the classroom. Tommy felt his heart sink a little. Part of him had hoped that his father had been looking for him all these years, maybe unable to find him but never giving up the search. Colonel Wilson seemed to notice Tommy's reaction and quickly continued. "That's not because I didn't want to know about you. It's because your grandmother never told me. She had very good reasons for that, which I'll explain to you when we have more time to talk privately." He reached into his jacket pocket again and pulled out a small photograph. It was old and slightly faded, showing a young man in a military training uniform standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Tommy recognized the woman immediately. It was his grandmother, but much younger than he had ever seen her. "This picture was taken about 10 years ago, before I was deployed overseas," Colonel Wilson explained, showing the photo to Tommy. Your grandmother and I were friends back then. Very good friends. But then I had to leave for a mission that was supposed to last 6 months and ended up lasting 3 years. Tommy took the photograph with shaking hands. He had never seen any pictures of his grandmother with a man before. She had always kept her past very private, never talking about boyfriends or relationships. But here was proof that she had once known this impressive military officer who was now claiming to be Tommy's father. When I came back from that mission, Colonel Wilson continued, your grandmother had moved away and I couldn't find her. I tried for months, but it was like she had disappeared completely. I never knew that she was pregnant when I left, and I never knew that she had given birth to a son. Billy, who had been listening intently to every word, raised his hand tentatively. Colonel Wilson nodded at him to speak. Sir, Billy said, his voice much more respectful than Tommy had ever heard it before. How did you find out about Tommy now? Colonel Wilson smiled slightly, the first time his serious expression had softened since he entered the classroom. Your grandmother is a very smart woman, Tommy. She's been keeping track of my career over the years, and she knew that I had been promoted to colonel and was working at the Pentagon. When she heard about what happened on career day, she realized that maybe it was time for Tommy to meet his father. Mrs. Johnson, who had been listening to everything with growing amazement, spoke up. Are you saying that Tommy's claim about his father working at the Pentagon was actually true, even though he didn't know it? That's exactly what I'm saying, Colonel Wilson replied. Sometimes children know things that they don't even realize. They know. Tommy's heart told him something that his mind couldn't explain. He turned back to Tommy, who was still holding the photograph and trying to absorb everything he was hearing. Tommy, I want you to know that I'm not here to disrupt your life or take you away from your grandmother. She's done an amazing job raising you, and I can see what a good, honest boy you've become. But I would like to be part of your life, if you want me to be. For the first time since Colonel Wilson had entered the classroom, Tommy found his voice. You really work at the Pentagon? He asked quietly. I really do, Colonel Wilson confirmed. I'm an intelligence analyst, which means I study information from around the world to help keep our country safe. It's not as exciting as what you see in movies, but it's important work, and I'm proud to do it. Tommy looked around at his classmates, many of whom were staring at him with expressions he had never seen before. Instead of the mockery and disbelief he had grown used to, he saw something that looked like respect, even admiration. Katie, who had always been one of the kinder kids in class, spoke up. Tommy, I'm really sorry we didn't believe you. You were telling the truth the whole time. This seemed to break a dam of emotions in the classroom. One by one, other students began to apologize. Even Billy, who had been the leader of most of the teasing, looked genuinely ashamed of how he had treated Tommy. I'm sorry too, Tommy, Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was really mean to you, and you didn't deserve that. Can we be friends? Tommy looked at Billy, then at the other kids who were nodding and murmuring their own apologies. For months he had felt like an outsider in his own classroom, like someone who didn't belong and couldn't be trusted. Now, suddenly, everything had changed. But the most important change was sitting right next to him. Tommy looked up at Colonel Wilson and asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Are you going to stay, or do you have to go back to your important work? Colonel Wilson's expression grew serious again, but not in a scary way. It was the seriousness of someone making an important promise. Tommy, I'm not going anywhere. I've already spoken with my commanding officer, and I've been reassigned to work at a base much closer to here. I'm going to rent an apartment nearby so that I can see you every day if you want me to. The classroom erupted in excited whispers. Mrs. Johnson had to call for quiet, but even she looked impressed by what she was hearing. But what about my grandmother? Tommy asked, suddenly worried. I don't want to leave her. She's taken care of me my whole life. You're not leaving your grandmother, Colonel Wilson assured him. She and I have already talked about this. We're going to work together to take care of you. She'll still be your grandmother who loves you and takes care of you every day. But now you'll also have a father who wants to be part of your life. As the morning continued, Colonel Wilson stayed in the classroom, and answered questions from the curious students. He showed them his Pentagon identification card, explained what his job involved, and even let them examine some of the medals on his uniform. He was patient with their questions and seemed to genuinely enjoy talking with them. When lunchtime came, Colonel Wilson asked if he could take Tommy to lunch at a restaurant near the school. Mrs. Johnson called the office to make sure it was okay, and soon Tommy found himself walking out of the school building next to his father, feeling like he was in a dream. At the restaurant, over hamburgers and French fries, Colonel Wilson told Tommy more about his work, his travels, and his life. He also listened carefully as Tommy told him about school, about his grandmother, and about how hard it had been to be teased for something that turned out to be true. "Tommy," Colonel Wilson said as they finished their lunch, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you for sticking to your story even when people didn't believe you. It takes courage to tell the truth when everyone around you thinks you're lying." When they returned to school for the afternoon, Tommy noticed that everything felt different. Kids who had ignored him for months were now eager to talk to him. Teachers who had looked at him with concern now smiled at him with respect. Even the principal stopped by the classroom to meet Colonel Wilson and congratulate Tommy. That evening, Tommy sat at the small kitchen table in his grandmother's apartment, telling her about the most amazing day of his life. His grandmother listened with tears in her eyes, holding his hand across the table. "Grandma," Tommy asked, "why didn't you ever tell me about my father before?" His grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "Tommy," she said finally, "I was afraid that if I told you about him, you would want to be with him more than with me. I was afraid of losing you. But when I heard about what happened at school, I realized that you needed to know the truth, and I realized that James needed to know about you too." Colonel Wilson had given Tommy his phone number and promised to call that evening. When the phone rang at 7 o'clock, Tommy felt excited rather than nervous for the first time in months. "Hello, Tommy," came his father's familiar voice through the phone. "How are you feeling about everything that happened today?" "I feel good," Tommy said honestly. "I feel like finally, people believe me." "They believe you because you were telling the truth," Colonel Wilson said. "Even when you didn't know you were telling the truth, your heart knew what was real." As Tommy went to bed that night, he thought about how much his life had changed in just one day. He was no longer the kid who made up stories about his father. He was no longer the outsider who didn't fit in with his classmates. He was Tommy Wilson, son of Colonel James Wilson, who worked at the Pentagon. And finally, everyone knew that his story had been true all along. The next morning at school, Tommy walked into his classroom with his head held high for the first time in months. And for the first time since career day, when Mrs. Johnson asked if anyone wanted to share something interesting that had happened to them, Tommy raised his hand with confidence and a smile.